Welcome to Year of Connection, a year-long journey toward becoming whole self-connected. I'm your host, Pauline Shu. I hope everyone has been enjoying the final days of winter, or at least the final days according to the calendar. We've still got plenty of cold weather and possibly even a bit of snow ahead, but even so, there's something about the idea of spring arriving that goes a long way toward brightening my day, despite the gray skies and low temperatures. In fact, that's what a lot of life is like, finding a happy balance between something we might not like so much and something that brings us joy, between the bad and the good, the difficult and the easy. Balance is important and present in so much of our life, including in our connections. That's why today's episode is about balance and its corresponding partner, imbalance. We are going to talk this week about what happens when two people's expectations for connection differ and how to overcome connection imbalance before it topples a relationship. Today we're going to talk about connection imbalance, but first we need to do a quick review of how things are going so far in your journey to whole self-connectedness. Let's talk briefly about your life notes. Are you still jotting those down? Take a moment to go over what you've written as you ask yourself 3 important questions. First, has your connections grid changed? If it has, make note of how and why it has. Think about the people whose connections with you are the most positive now versus when you first made the grid. Do you feel stronger and more supported in your core values because of those connections? Second, we've talked about the importance of working on ourselves before moving outward. These discussions included accepting love, expressing gratitude, disconnecting from the noise of technology, and working through jealous feelings. Looking only at these topics, were there any areas where you felt you were already excelling and didn't need work? Any areas where you feel you still need work? Third, the past 2 episodes have been more outward focused, including a charge to join something with enthusiasm and to gain perspective about your life in reference to your place in the larger world. Have you joined something? And do you feel confident that you have a good understanding of yourself relative to others? I urge you to stop and think about these questions before moving forward with this episode, because finding the right balance in connections is best achieved when both sides have a solid foundation within themselves as well as are a part of something bigger than themselves. Those things will continue to evolve as we move through this year, but this is the first point at which we have made enough investment across multiple areas of our connectedness that we can now start talking about balance. We'll come back to this idea of balanced connection over time, so don't worry if you don't have everything from the previous episodes to a perfect state. And to be honest, it will never be perfect. We are human after all. The most important qualification for fixing your connection imbalances is that you approach this process with positivity and honesty. And those 2 things often come through making positive, honest changes in yourself and in your perspective. So if you do feel confident in where you are, let's go ahead and dive into talking about connection imbalance. Let's touch briefly on imbalances that occur on a superficial level so that we're all on the same page with regard to what that means. When I talk about superficial imbalances, I am talking about outward appearances or behaviors that have nothing or very little to do with core values. If, for example, I have a friend who is much prettier than I am, which this is true, by the way, and as a result, people often talk more to her than to me when we're out together, I might call that a connection imbalance. But it's not. It doesn't mean I'm not jealous sometimes. I sure am. She's beautiful. But the way she looks is not relevant to the way she and I connect on the level of our core values. We also have similar standards of behavior, and while I'm certain that her outward appearance sometimes influences her experiences, She processes those experiences through her values, and it doesn't affect our connection. If you are feeling a connection imbalance like this, it's time to reevaluate your own feelings, including both ones of jealousy and potentially ones of superiority. We'll talk more in a second about feeling superior, but spoiler alert, it's not a desirable behavior. One tricky question is around someone's manners, because often good manners are a part of our standards of behavior, but they're also really subjective depending on the culture we come from. For example, for some cultures, it's perfectly polite to talk with one's mouth full of food. In others, there's a requirement in their families of eating meals in complete silence. I mean, complete silence. Not even talking to pass the potatoes. Here, I'm describing my father's and my mother's backgrounds, respectively. In my family, meals became quite a cultural compromise, and it wasn't easy. But ultimately, the manners that each parent displayed while eating fell on the superficial side of the imbalance, and they were able to overcome it. Their shared core values of investing positively in their family to create a happy and productive next generation, and helping love to triumph over adversity in any situation, were more impactful in their connection. And again, in this example, it's the focus on core values that won out. Jealousy and superiority did not play a role in this particular example. Frustration certainly did. But through honest discussions, my parents worked out a way to acclimate one another to who they were when it comes to table manners. For some people, this might be less superficial than in the case of my parents, because your standards of behavior might be tied very closely to manners from a certain culture. In this case, I would advise you to be mindful of whether or not those manners truly mean something in terms of whether or not you're a good person, or whether your perception of those manners might be changed to accommodate someone with a different outward display of the same core values. Now, y'all probably all know how I feel when there's an imbalance at the level of core value. The person with whom you're interacting is most likely not going to be a core connection. And in that case, the imbalance is easier to see than when there's a problem at a different level. And I'm going to explain that now. This has happened to me in the past more times than I want to admit, in large part because of my shortcomings, but one story stands out more than others, and I'm going to share that one. Many years ago, I befriended a woman who was going through a hard time. She had a child with special needs and was going through a divorce, and we met through an online group before we decided to then meet in person. Having heard her story before meeting her in person, I am ashamed to admit that I walked into that first get-together with a sense of pity toward her. And in my mind, I was playing the role of support and savior. Boy, was that a mistake. And this is where I'm going to talk about the problem of superiority. In the case of imbalance, where you do match up in your core values, you have similar standards of behavior, and there's no obvious outward or superficial imbalance, superiority can be a real issue. I have a friend who sums this up nicely, and she calls it the entry-level manager syndrome. That's not a real thing, by the way. You won't find it in business textbooks. She just made it up. But the essence of it is this. Entry-level manager syndrome is when a new manager has a difficult time understanding that just because a task is done differently and by someone else other than them, it doesn't mean it's done incorrectly and incompetently. I walked into that connection with an air of superiority. I had entry-level manager syndrome so bad. I came in thinking that I was there to help this woman, that I was there to offer suggestions on how she could do it better. And because I created that connection imbalance with my attitude, it didn't matter that we had a lot of shared values. It didn't matter that we had similar standards of behavior. What we expected to get out of the relationship did not align. The imbalance of expectation was too big for the connection to last, and eventually that friendship simply faded away. The failed connection experience with this woman was a wake-up call. I finally understood that shared values and standards of behavior are great, but they're not everything. And that's why we're talking about connection imbalance today. If you're feeling like despite your work on your core connections, on yourself and your interactions with the world, you're still not feeling more whole self-connected, your relationships might need a shift in the way you view what you're giving and what you're receiving. It's time to level the playing field. I had to experience the same mind shift with this woman whom I wrongly put into a position of need, even if it was never spoken out loud. This woman whom I wrongly assumed would appreciate what my supposedly superior knowledge could provide. It was an immature way to look at the world and a destructive way to connect. Those connections are often short-lived or dysfunctional. I had to realize that I had entry-level manager syndrome on a much bigger scale than just in a job. I had it when it came to people's lives. I had to shift my way of thinking to understand that just because her life is being lived differently doesn't mean she was doing it wrong. I cannot live anyone else's life better than they can, and no one can live mine better than I can. And ultimately, my problem when I finally took a good hard look at myself was that even though I was saying all the right things when it came to my core values and my standards of behavior, in fact, I was prideful, I was vain, and paradoxically fragile, which meant that I thought I knew best, but I would lash out at anyone who dared to say otherwise. It was a challenge to change. I went through a lot of pain and a lot of hard times to come to terms with the kind of person I really was, even though I didn't want to. Even though my mind and sometimes my body fought the change, I did manage to do it. It's still a work in progress, but the ever-deepening sense of connection I have with myself and others encourages me to come back to this process every day. Your situation might not be exactly the same, but if you evaluate your core connections and cannot readily see any mismatches in terms of values or behavior, it's time to look at your expectations. If that doesn't help, it may well be that the disconnect lies with the other person's expectations. In those cases, you have a decision to make on whether to have an honest discussion with the other person on how to fix it, or to accept that the connection you thought was strong might not be adding as much to your life as you had believed. Either way, honesty and self-reflection are critical components of making a healthy decision. However, this is a time when I will recommend that if you are in a position where someone else believes they're better than you, or they're suffering from entry-level manager syndrome, or if you've made your best attempts to talk to them about their behavior, to encourage them to be better, but nothing changes, it's time to place less importance on that connection. For the sake of your health and the health of your connectedness, you don't have to cut off that relationship completely, but it is important that you distance yourself from a dynamic like that. I hope that this week's episode brings balance to your life. If you would like to share thoughts about balance, whether it be about connection or something else, I'd love to hear them. You can leave a comment on this show's post or send me an email. And if you've enjoyed listening to this episode or any other Year of Connection episodes, consider leaving a rating or review on iTunes or other app that you're listening on. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week, and in the meantime, I wish you safe travels.